Welcome to Restoria, your cozy corner for gentle bedtime stories. My name is James and I'll be your host tonight. Every night, we bring you peaceful tales designed to calm your mind and help you drift off into a deep, restful sleep. So snuggle in, close your eyes, and let the story begin. The story tonight is called Maple, the Next Beautiful Nowhere. Chapter 1. The Lake That Waited. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees when Lila spotted the turn off a narrow gravel path just wide enough for a single set of tires, lined with grass that brushed the belly of their little camper van, Maple. "Think we'll fit?" she asked, hand on the wheel, gaze flicking between the trees. Theo leaned forward, peering through the windshield. "If we don't, we'll just become part of the forest." From the back seat, Miso gave a soft huff. It sounded like agreement. Lila smiled and turned the wheel. Maple eased down the path, tires crunching gently over stones. Pine branches kissed the roof as they crept along, the canopy thickening above. Then, just as the light began to shift into that warm amber color that makes everything look like memory, the trees opened. A lake waited beyond, still, wide, and dark as glass. The shoreline curved gently around, ringed by tall trees whose reflections shimmered on the water. A heron stood knee-deep in the far shallows, unmoving, watching them like a statue of calm. "Perfect," Theo said. Lila pulled Maple into the flattest patch of grass and turned off the engine. The sudden quiet was soft and full. No distant roads, no phone signals, just wind and water. Theo opened his door and stepped out into the fading day. The air smelled like pine and damp moss, and the lake breathed coolness into the warm dusk. "Chairs?" he asked. "Cocoa," Lila said, climbing into the back. Miso jumped out of the van and immediately began inspecting the perimeter, tail wagging low and slow. He circled once, twice, then picked a patch of grass under a birch tree and collapsed with a thump. By the time Theo unfolded the camp chairs and lit the small lantern, Lila was pouring warm cocoa into enamel mugs and toasting thick slices of bread on the tiny stove. The camper glowed from within, fairy lights flicked on, casting soft halos along the wood-paneled walls. Theo set the chairs facing the lake, close enough to hold hands but far enough to give space for Miso's blanket in between. When Lila stepped out with the mugs, he met her halfway. They sat, sipped, listened. The heron took flight, silent and slow, disappearing into the trees. Miso snored lightly at their feet. Fireflies began to blink between the reeds, their glow a slow Morse code for rest. "I wish we could stay here forever," Lila whispered. Theo turned his head to look at her. "Who says we can't?" She smiled, but didn't answer. Instead, she leaned her head on his shoulder, and they watched the lake darken as the stars came out, one by one. Later, after the cocoa was gone and Miso had been tucked into his travel blanket, they climbed back into Maple. The van smelled like warm bread and pine wood. The windows were cracked just enough to let the cool night air whisper through. A string of dried lavender swung gently above their bed. Lila turned out the lights. The camper creaked once as they shifted into sleep and then settled. Somewhere outside, an owl called. Inside, 3 heartbeats moved in quiet rhythm. Maple didn't move again until morning, because the lake had waited for them, and they had listened. Chapter 2: A Morning Made of Stillness. The first thing Lila noticed was how blue the morning was. Not bright or loud, but hushed. A cool, pale kind of blue that drifted through the curtains like it had taken its time getting there. The air smelled of wet leaves and lake water, and when she cracked the window wider, it carried the scent of earth and something faintly sweet, wild mint maybe, or the last bloom of something shy. Miso was already awake, stretched long across the end of the bed, one paw twitching in a dream. Theo snored gently beside her, his hand curled near his chin, his dark curls rumpled against the pillow. She slipped out of bed quietly, toes meeting the wooden floor with a soft thud, and pulled on a sweater. The fairy lights were still on, casting a sleepy golden glow through Maple's small kitchen. She clicked the kettle on and pulled a tin of tea from the shelf. Outside, the lake was completely still. Not a single ripple touched the surface. The trees mirrored themselves so perfectly in the water it made Lila blink twice. She opened the van door slowly. Mist hovered over the ground like something undecided about leaving. She stepped down barefoot, letting the dewy grass kiss her skin. In her hands, the warm mug of tea pulsed like a heartbeat. Miso's ears perked up. He trotted after her, slow and lazy, pausing to sniff every wild mushroom and leaf that looked interesting enough. Lila padded down to the shore and sat cross-legged on a flat stone, Miso settling beside her. The world was still waking up. A single dragonfly danced over the lake. Somewhere in the trees, a woodpecker started its slow rhythm. A fish leapt once in the distance, its splash soft enough to sound like a whisper. Lila sipped her tea and leaned back on her hands. Eventually, Theo joined her. His sweater was zipped up to his chin, and his eyes still held the softness of sleep. "Looks like the lake's holding its breath," he said. She nodded. "Feels like we're the only ones here." Theo sat beside her, his mug full of coffee. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. The air between them was as easy as the space between waves. After a while, Theo stood. "Want to walk the edge?" Lila glanced at Miso, who had rolled onto his back with all 4 paws in the air. "Give him 10 more minutes and he'll lead the way." They wandered slowly along the shoreline, their feet squishing in damp moss, hands brushing tall grasses. They found smooth stones, a single feather, a stump carved with initials from long ago. Lila tucked a bright yellow leaf into her journal. Theo skipped a flat rock across the lake heat, bounced 4 times before vanishing. When they returned, Miso was waiting near Maple, tail wagging like a metronome. Breakfast was simple. Warm bread toasted on the skillet, eggs scrambled with green onions and a pinch of thyme. They ate on their laps in the open doorway of the van, legs dangling over the grass, the smell of cooking still clinging to the air. Afterward, they cleaned up slowly. No rush, no plans. Theo pulled out a paperback novel and sprawled in one of the camp chairs. Lila picked up her sketchbook and sat under the birch tree, cross-legged in the sun. Miso chased a grasshopper, then lay down halfway through the chase, apparently satisfied with the effort. It wasn't a morning full of adventure. It was a morning full of being. And sometimes, Lila thought, those were the ones that stayed with you the longest. Inside Maple, the fairy lights twinkled even in daylight. A slice of bread cooled on the stove. One curtain fluttered in the breeze. The day had no destination. And that, to all three of them, felt exactly right. Chapter 3: Maps Made of Memory. After lunch, the sun filtered through the trees in thin golden slices. Lila sat on the camper's step with a deck of old postcards spread out on her lap. Most were secondhand picked up in dusty shops in sleepy towns. Some were from Theo's childhood, others from places they hadn't reached yet. A few had messages they'd never mailed, written in the kind of quiet you only share when you're far away from everything. Theo stepped around her barefoot, a small hammer tucked in his belt, and a length of string in one hand. "You think this stretch of ceiling could hold them?" Lila looked up. The wood paneling above their bed was already home to lavender sprigs, paper stars, and 3 Polaroids strung together with clothespins. But there was room. Definitely. She passed him the ones with the blank-back scenes of lighthouses, foggy ridges, wildflowers bursting beside train tracks. Places they hadn't yet been, but planned to dream about. While Theo hung the line, Lila picked out a card with a worn edge. It was a photo of a field full of daisies, the color faded like an old song. On the back, in Lila's handwriting, "Somewhere, we'll find this field, and we'll stay long enough for tea." Miso let out a sigh from his blanket nest by the open van door. He liked it when they talked about staying. Staying meant warm meals and long naps and no seatbelt. Once the postcards were up, fluttering gently in the cross breeze, Theo leaned against the cabinets. "We've been on the road for what, 2 years?" he said. Lila smiled. 1 year, 10 months, and 3 weeks. But who's counting? Think we'll ever want a house again? She considered that. Maybe. Someday. But it'd have to smell like pine wood and dog and have a bed that creaks like maple. Theo laughed. So, basically maple, but with plumbing. Exactly. They both paused, letting the wind speak for a moment. Then Lila asked, "What do you remember most? About the trip?" She nodded. Theo looked up at the ceiling. "The cliffs in Oregon. That rainstorm in the redwoods. You baking bread while we were parked in that snowstorm. Miso barking at cows in Montana. That sunrise. Over the dunes." He grinned. "And you?" Lila leaned back on her hands, waking up to the sound of waves, falling asleep to crickets. That one night we stayed behind the bakery and they gave us free rolls. She hesitated. And this exact day, Theo tilted his head. This one? She looked around. Yeah, because nothing huge happened. And I don't feel like we're missing anything. He nodded slowly. That's a good reason. The rest of the afternoon passed in fragments, pages turned, sketches half finished, the low sound of a playlist drifting from inside the van. Miso explored the same patch of woods at least 6 times and found nothing new each time, which didn't seem to disappoint him. Later, they walked a short trail that wrapped around the lake. The light filtered through the trees like stained glass, and everything smelled like pine and wet stone. When they got back, Maple was already glowing from within. Fairy lights flicked on. Dinner was simple: roasted sweet potatoes, rice, a squeeze of lemon, and tea with honey. After they ate, Lila added a sticker to the back of Maple's cabinet door, just a tiny pine tree, hand-drawn. One more marker on the map they were making from memory. Theo traced it with his thumb. We should name this spot. She smiled. Blue Lake? Miso Meadow? Lake Weighted, he said, echoing her words from the night before. Lake Weighted, she repeated. Yeah, that's the one. Outside, the stars began to appear, just 1 or 2 at first. Enough. They didn't need to go anywhere tomorrow. Maybe not even the day after. The road would wait, and the sky, and the lake, and the soft creak of their little home. Chapter 4: The Sound of Nowhere. The next morning, Maple stayed parked. Not because anything was broken, or because they'd run out of places to go, but because sometimes the best thing to do was nothing at all. Lila stretched across the bed, half awake, listening to the light rain tap against the camper's roof. It wasn't a storm, just the kind of steady drizzle that made everything smell fresh. Theo was still asleep, curled toward the window, one arm draped where Miso had been before relocating to the foot of the bed. She reached for her journal and jotted down a few lines. Not full thoughts, just phrases. Rain on pine. Miso's muddy paws. This quiet feels like something we earned. A little while later, she climbed down and padded barefoot into the kitchenette. The stove clicked to life with a soft hum. Maple warmed up quickly, steam curling up from the kettle and fogging the window over the sink. Theo stirred. Mornin'. You've got 2 more minutes before I steal your half of the blanket. He smiled without opening his eyes. Joke's on you, it's your blanket. Miso thumped his tail in sleepy agreement. After tea and a breakfast of warm banana oats, they pulled out the folding table and set it by the van's open doors. Rain still fell, but more lightly now, just enough to whisper. Lila worked on a watercolor sketch of the lake, while Theo fiddled with Maple's little toolbox, tightening screws that didn't need it, and oiling hinges that did. Miso trotted in and out, collecting damp leaves in his fur and proudly depositing them onto their pillows. By midday, the sun peeked through the clouds in thin beams. Everything glistened. Water dripped from every branch, sparkled on every blade of grass. Theo brought out the guitar. He didn't play often, but when he did, it was never loud. His fingers moved like memory, plucking simple chords in quiet melodies. No lyrics, just the kind of music that wandered in loops like smoke. Lila hummed as she painted. At some point, they noticed a pair of deer standing just beyond the trees, one tall, one younger, their ears high and still. Miso didn't bark. He just sat beside the van like he knew they were guests, not interruptions. The deer watched for a while, then turned and vanished, silent as morning fog. "That's the kind of moment you don't write down," Theo said quietly. "Why not?" "Because it already knows how to stay." They made soup for dinner, something hearty and simple. Carrots, lentils, a sprig of rosemary Theo found near the trail. The kind of meal that made you feel like you'd been hugged from the inside. That night, they didn't sit in chairs. They brought out the blanket instead and lay on their backs in the grass, heads touching, feet pointed opposite ways. The sky was clear again, stars in every direction. No schedule, no reservations, just sky. "Do you think we'll ever get tired of this?" Lila asked. Theo turned his head to look at her. "Of what?" She gestured vaguely. "The quiet, the drifting, the slowness of it." He thought for a moment. "I don't think so. I think we'll forget what rushing feels like before we forget this." She didn't answer, just reached over and linked her pinky with his. Miso curled beside them with a sigh. When they climbed into Maple later, toes chilled, cheeks pink from the evening air, Lila pressed her hand against the wood-paneled wall and whispered, "Thank you." Maple creaked as if answering. She didn't know if she meant the van, the place, or the day itself. Maybe all of them. As they drifted off, the rain returned, just a few drops, soft as thoughts. They fell asleep, listening to the sound of nowhere, and woke with the sense that they'd been exactly where they were supposed to be. Chapter 5. The Road Between Moments. They left the lake the next morning, not because they needed tow, but because the road was calling in the softest way, like a page turning. Maple rolled slowly out of the clearing, tires crunching over gravel and dew. Lila sat cross-legged in the passenger seat, balancing a bowl of granola and fresh fruit on her knee. Theo drove one-handed, the other resting near the gear shift, fingers tapping lightly to the rhythm of a half-remembered song. Miso sat on the floor between them, nose pressed to the vent, eyes half closed. The morning light slanted through the windshield, dappling the dashboard with warm gold. Trees passed by like old friends waving from a distance. "Next stop?" Theo asked. Lila pulled out the map, not a real one, not with names or directions. It was their own version, hand-sketched and full of hearts and stars and tiny symbols. "There's that orchard 2 hours south, and I think there's a trail nearby with a view of the valley." Theo nodded. "Let's see where we end up." They took turns picking the music. Lila queued up soft indie tunes. Theo added scratchy jazz from an old playlist. Miso occasionally barked at passing cows and then promptly fell back asleep. They stopped at a roadside stand selling baskets of peaches and honey in mismatched jars. The woman behind the table wore a sun hat and smelled like lavender. She waved as they drove away. By midday, they reached a field. Not the orchard, just a field. Golden and open, the kind that made you want to lie down and look at the sky. Theo pulled off the road. They parked beneath a crooked oak tree, its branches casting dappled shade across Maple's roof. Lunch was bread with goat cheese, a few of the peaches, and cold tea. Afterward, they lay in the tall grass, Lila's head on Theo's stomach, Miso curled up between them like a comma. The clouds moved slowly. Theo pointed up. "That one looks like your hair on a windy day." Lila snorted. "That one looks like your guitar after it's been stepped on." They laughed quietly, like they didn't want to scare the day away. Later, Lila wrote in her journal, "Not all days need a purpose. Some are just bridges. Places to rest between the ones we remember more clearly. But maybe, in the end, those are the days we needed most." They took the long way after that. Back roads and old logging trails. They saw a fox cross in front of them, pausing only to blink at Maple before disappearing into ferns. In the afternoon, they pulled off again, this time at the base of a small hill. From the top, the world opened up. A patchwork of fields and trees and winding roads stretched into the horizon. The wind was stronger up there, and it carried the scent of pine, dust, and something sweet, maybe clover. They didn't say much. They just stood side by side, arms brushing, looking out. When they returned to Maple, the sun was already dipping. Shadows stretched long across the road. That night, they parked in a quiet grove just beyond a wooden fence. Fireflies blinked along the grass line, and somewhere in the distance, frogs sang in a broken chorus. They cooked pasta on the tiny stove, opened the windows, and let the warm air wander through. Theo found a photo strip they'd taken at a fair 2 towns back and tucked it under the string of fairy lights. Miso made his usual 3 full circles on the bed before plopping down with a sigh. Before sleeping, Lila whispered, "Do you think we'll always live like this?" Theo turned his head. "I don't know, but I hope the next version of us still remembers what this feels like." She nodded, eyes already closing. Maple rocked slightly in the breeze. Outside, the road waited. But for now, they were between places, between plans, and perfectly content to stay there. Chapter 6: Stars Between the Pines. They stayed in the grove the next day. Miso had claimed it as his kingdom, sniffing every stump and chasing shadows between the trees. Theo said he wasn't ready to go anywhere that didn't smell like wild mint and wood smoke. And Lila, curled in the passenger seat with a book open and her feet propped on the dash, couldn't argue. The sun rose slow and warm, dappling the grove with honey-colored light. Maple wore it like a shawl. Inside, breakfast was lazy leftover bread warmed on the stove, jam from a tiny jar they'd been saving, slices of apple, and a drizzle of honey. They moved at the pace of light through leaves. Midday was quiet and soft. Theo wrote postcards they'd never send. Lila braided her hair and made a daisy chain for Miso, who wore it like a crown and immediately fell asleep in a puddle of sun. Later, Theo hung the hammock between two tall pines and read until his book slipped from his chest. Lila sketched the grove, the van, and Theo napping each line simple, each shadow full of stillness. That evening, they cooked stew on the portable fire ring. Potatoes, carrots, garlic, salt. The scent filled the grove like a promise. As they ate, the sky deepened to that shade of blue. That means the stars are waiting. When darkness settled fully, they dragged their blanket onto the grass and lay on their backs, shoulder to shoulder. The pines swayed gently overhead. Miso snuggled into the crook of Lila's arm. The stars came slow, patient, confident. Theo pointed. "That one looks like a spoon." "That's just a spoon," Lila said, smiling. "It's part of the Big Dipper." Then I was right. They laughed quietly. The wind carried the scent of pine resin and cooled their cheeks. Crickets sang soft and steady. Somewhere far away, an owl made its slow, thoughtful call. Lila exhaled deeply. "If we had a real house, I think I'd miss this." "This?" She nodded. "Being under the stars, hearing the wind in trees that don't belong to us, waking up to birds we don't recognize." Theo turned his head to look at her. "Then we won't trade it in." "Not yet." They didn't move for a long time. Eventually, they gathered their blanket and climbed into Maple. The van welcomed them like a worn-in story. Fairy lights glowed softly. The bed was warm. The night had no sharp edges. Lila tucked a new Polaroid into the frame above the window. The grove in twilight. Fireflies caught mid-blink. Miso curled between them with a sigh that meant here. And Theo whispered just before sleep, "There's no version of home I like better than this." Maple creaked once in the wind. The stars held steady, and the world, for that night, asked nothing more of them than to rest. Chapter 7. The Next Beautiful Nowhere. They left the grove after 3 slow mornings, the kind that stretch like soft shadows and leave their scent on your clothes. Not because they'd run out of reasons to stay, but because they felt ready to find the next reason to stop. Maple's windows were streaked with dew as they rolled back onto the road. The forest thinned, sunlight spilling wider, and the sound of gravel under the tires gave way to the low hum of asphalt. Lila leaned against the window with a notebook open in her lap, sketching the trees as they blurred by. Theo drove with one hand, the other resting near the heat vent where Miso had tucked his snout. They passed empty fields, quiet barns, a lone swing hanging from a tree that had no house near it. By afternoon, they found it. A wide meadow bordered by whispering aspens and backed by hills. Wildflowers in every direction, swaying like they were waiting to be noticed. A small sign wooden crooked dread. Trailhead, 1 mile. Lila pointed. "Let's see where it goes." They parked Maple just off the path and packed a thermos of tea, 2 granola bars, and a camera with 1 photo left. The trail wound gently through trees, never steep, never loud. The kind of trail that didn't need markers because it felt like it already knew where you were going. Miso trotted ahead, tail high, ears bouncing. At the top of the hill, the land opened. A ridgeline rolled into a valley below. Distant rivers shimmered like silver thread. Everything felt bigger up their sky. Silence, possibility. They sat on a flat rock, sharing the thermos. Lila took the last photo. Theo, squinting into the light, with Miso resting against his hip and the valley wide behind them. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. That evening, they didn't set up chairs. They didn't light the lantern or heat up dinner. They just lay in the back of the van, doors open to the cooling world, limbs tangled under the quilt, breath sinking with the rise and fall of the breeze. As stars returned familiar now, constant companions, Lila whispered, "You think we'll always find places like this?" Theo kissed her hair. "I think places like this find us." Miso thumped his tail once, just once, then settled. Maple, warm and content, creaked softly as the night unfolded. Outside, the wind moved through tall grass. Inside, the heartbeats of 3 travelers stilled into sleep. No plans, no map, just the next beautiful nowhere, waiting patiently like it always had.